in prison, but he never talked about it. He did that because he was objecting to a patriotic war. Behind that was a principled man. Imagine war resistance to a war based on principle for people of that generation. And then reflect on what we can learn from history. What should we, as tenured professors, be doing with our freedom of speech in a time of a dubious war? What is the role of the professoriate? As a student of Julian Jaynes between 1967 and 1969, the Vietnam era, I had the privilege of being mentored by a war resister. And you can bet I was thinking about war resistance during every day of graduate school at Princeton. Ironically, Julian never mentioned his own war resistance. I did not know that Julian went to prison. What was Julian's message to me? It was, Bill, to build a career, don't work at summer camp in your first year of grad school, summer. Begin to act like a professional. Bill, if you're going to apply for a job, you have to have reprints. Save them and keep them clean. Julian was a consummate professional, and yet he was a maverick scholar of tremendous principle. But in his fatherly role to me, he chose to keep his principles for himself and to honor the evolution of my consciousness and my principles. He came to dinner in my young family 10 years later. We said grace, and when grace was over, he said, Bill, you don't believe that? Well, it's a ritual for us. It's good for the children, I said. But of course, that helped my consciousness to evolve. Julian was the son of a Unitarian minister. Julian did not believe in Christ. Julian did not believe in ritual except as an illustration of the evolution of consciousness. Bill, you don't believe that. In other words, Bill, evolve yourself. And sure enough, I have evolved. I'm now a Quaker where I go for an hour of silence every week. Not because I share their theology, which is related to the Puritans, it's Christian-based. Not because of that. I'm a closet Unitarian. But because I need that hour of quiet and the discipline of silence and the respect for other persons, especially the gender balance that you get in a Quaker meeting. So to come back to my talk, I was going to say, if you want to know more about Julian's life up to 1976, when he was 56, I have a longer chapter which I've submitted to Marcel, and I can tell you all about it based on archival documents, some of which are in an attic, or were in an attic here in Capac by the sea near Charlottetown. But today, because of this audience, I've chosen to answer what I thought might be one of your questions. Was there more to the origin of consciousness after the book, after 1976? The appearance in mid-January 1977 of Jaynes' The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind generated much attention. Book reviews quickly appeared with words of praise, questioning, and confusion. Among the many well-known reviewers were Christopher Lehmann-Haupt for the New York Times in February and Marshall McLuhan for the Toronto Globe and Mail in June 1977. Invitations to speak soon followed, as did requests for interviews. Sam Keen wrote about Jaynes and his theory for Psychology Today. Richard Rhodes' article, Alone in the Country of the Mind, The Origin of Julian Jaynes, appeared in Quest magazine in 1978. Rhodes revealed the most about Jaynes' life and motivation, but no one explored his biography in depth, nor did they base their work on archival documents. In both respects, June Tower, Julian's neighbor in West Newton, and I have felt privileged to be able to explore a bit deeper. We've written of his early life, but feel that this conference would be best served with a review of the further development of Jaynes' theory in the context of his life after 1976. That is, from age 56 to his death at age 77 in 1997. But first we need to backtrack to a decision made before publication of The Origin that eventually led to much frustration, both for Jaynes and for his audience. As originally planned, Jane's book would have presented a significant amount of additional material, including his writings on the consequences of consciousness. However, the manuscript as submitted was much longer than usual book length, and his publisher felt that it somehow had to be shortened. Rather than try to abridge the heart of the thesis, it was decided to save the consequences of consciousness for a second volume to appear in a couple of years. Though he would have preferred to present it all at once, Janes reluctantly agreed, thinking that given a little more time, he could add to and improve the left-out chapters. Now let's see what happened in the restructuring of the manuscript by comparing the table of contents of the manuscript he submitted to Houghton Mifflin with the final book. The picture is a complicated one. I meant to bring a handout so that you could follow me. I forgot the handout. You can request it. I'll send it by attachment. But today I'm just going to present it verbally. First of all, he dropped Book 3, Chapter 3, Dreams. Was it written? It would have been written. There are fragments. He dropped Chapter 4, The Mind of the Child. Does it exist in toto? No, in fragments. Then, notice what happened. Well, I'm going to skip this. He divided up another chapter into 3 parts. The chapter on vestiges of bicamerality in modern times. An added piece of it to other parts of the book, which you can follow in the written version of this talk. And beyond this, he wrote 3 new chapters. Chapter 3 of Poetry and Music, Chapter 4, Hypnosis, and Chapter 6, The Auguries of Science. But the most important fact is that he dropped Chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the last book on dreams, the mind of the child, and the mind of the tribe. These were to constitute the beginning of the proposed second book. These are fragmentary manuscripts, not in a form that he would have wanted published, clearly intended to develop his thinking based on contemporary research about children and dreams, and even had a title, The Consequences of Consciousness. The Mind of the Child has the fullest table of contents. It's perhaps illustrative of the way Julian's constructed an argument. We have a rhetorician here. First, he thought about children's consciousness as a cognitive scientist. He formulated the problem. He considered the categories we use to see children. Then he adduced evidence of bicamerality in young children. Then he brought in a variety of empirical evidence. And only then did he look at the children of antiquity. I submit that he was not primarily an anthropologist or a historian of religion. He was coming out of psychology as a discipline, but then I think he was reading that theory back into history and interacting with the past, as a historian does. In a fragment for The Mind of the Tribe, the other missing chapter, which never made it to print, he wrote of the need to go beyond the major civilizations treated in his book, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Sumer, Assyria, Mycenae, Greece, and the Hebrews, to, quote, he wanted to go to other smaller agricultural civilizations, presumably bicameral. That's a quote from him. Janes continued his interest in archaeology, and it was particularly enthusiastic about the work on China and bicamerality by Michael Carr, a protege of his. Jane's mind was far from dormant, and it did not deviate from his lifelong pursuit of answers to the puzzle of consciousness. Let us follow his journey. In 1977, he published The Remembrance of Things Past, spelling out, quote, a space of unhappening events, of associations and experience through which we can move about in any direction. It is, of course, metaphor space. In 1978, his commentary on papers by animal psychologists Donald Griffith, David Premack, and Sue Savage-Rumbaugh appeared. In it he complained, quote, all 3 papers seem to say that because animal behavior can be made to simulate aspects of human behavior, therefore such animals are similar to human conscious functioning. It's the same argument used with that other method of cognitive processes, computer intelligence. But, to use a wildly dissimilar and probably inaccurate example, because Mickey Mouse looks and behaves so humanly on a screen does not mean that a celluloid film is conscious. It means that he's made to look conscious. Janes, 1978. Jane's argument cut deeper than animal analogies. It was a theory rooted in the evocative power of language to transform consciousness. Metaphor conveyed consciousness by spatializing, his novel term, the physical world. This claim required empirical evidence of all sorts, from archaeological to psychological. Yet the time scale was much too rapid for evolution, physical or cultural. Hence another novelty in his theory. This change occurred in only 600 years, from 1200 BC to 600 BC. He wrote a brief commentary called Paleolithic Cave Paintings as Eidetic Images in Brain and Behavioral Sciences in 1979. The Meaning of King Tut, The Dragons of the Shang Dynasty, The Visions of William Blake, all for Art World. He embraced interdisciplinarity, as few have done in our time. One feature of this interdisciplinary grasp of the past for Janes came from his religious roots. He was raised a Unitarian by his mother, Clara Bullard Janes, and he admired his father, the Reverend Julian Clifford Janes, a Unitarian minister whom he'd never really known. His father gained prominence as a minister in West Newton, but he had remarried late in life and died when Julian was only 2. He died on the ferry crossing to PEI, where the family had a summer cottage, leaving a young wife in her 20s with 3 infant children, 3 children under the age of 3. Julian read the books in his father's library, which used to be in West Newton, and migrated eventually to Keppoch by the sea. He browsed through the many, and then ended up here at PEI, thanks to Scott Greer. He browsed through the many boxes of his father's sermons stored in the family's attic. You can imagine young Julian learning his Unitarianism through learning his father's mind in the attic. The heart of his theory comes from comparing the Old and New Testaments, a minister's son. In 1978, he lectured at Emory University in the Department of Religion. In Psalm 42, for example, he said, God is depicted as a commanding presence. As the hart pants after the water brook, my mind thirsts for God's, living God's. When shall I come face to face with God? Psalm 42. Indeed, the bicameral mind is an obedient mind. By contrast, in the New Testament, John 2, we read, Whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall be in him as a well of water, springing up with everlasting life. The well inside you is consciousness, James explained. It is a metaphor. And thirst is the metaphor. Jesus, he added, was trying to reform Judaism. Julian was trying to reform Christianity. Perhaps the best clue to how Janes was developing his theory comes from his beloved undergraduate seminar, Psychology 319, The Psychology of Consciousness. He taught it from at least 1979 to 1992. He covered his own book in the first 4 weeks, then spent 6 more weeks going beyond it. Would that we had a tape of Julian's seminar. Would that I had been there. But I left Princeton in 1969. This course began in 1979. We have people in the room who knew Julian in the 1980s. Brian McVeigh in particular, whom I'll be tape recording soon. As a biographer, I want to capture any evidence I can of how Julian's mind and character developed. The first week of the course was called The Nature of Consciousness, Its Features and Modes. It drew on introductions to chapters in an anthology called Consciousness and the Brain, edited by Globus et al., 1976. It also drew on William James' Stream of Thought, 1890. I could mention more. This is very selective, but his syllabus is direct evidence of what he was reading and teaching during this period, going beyond, but also building on the sources that he'd already used in his book. I've tried to pull out the new ones. In the second week, he turned to, quote, The Bicameral Mind, Its Neurology and Evolution, again, based on his book. In addition to assigning the second half of Book 1 and the first half of Book 2, he added J.E. Bogan's The Other Side of the Brain for reading, and Ruth Lay's Emotion and the Right Hemisphere, 1981. He was deepening the lateralization thesis He was also showing a film, Left Brain, Right Brain. In the third week, he covered the topic Mind from 9000 BC to 1000 AD, marching the students through the second half of his own Book 2 and the first half of Book 3. He also had them skim Amos and Ecclesiastes from the Bible to compare bicamerality as it evolved into consciousness. He finished off his book in week 4, that is, the students finished reading his book in week 4, in a unit called Alterations of Consciousness in Hypnosis and Schizophrenia, which was in the final part of the book, assigning new material on hypnosis from Ernest Hilgard.